and we looked at an example of a reflex action that was the Irish reflex. Then today, I want us to look at what we call reflex arc, or the nerves involved in a reflex action. When we talk about a reflex arc, we mean a nerve pathway of a reflex action. A nerve pathway, or how impulses move from the sensory receptors up to the effectors that produce a response or a reflex action. We call it a reflex arc because this term, arc, it means that the pathway goes into the nerve impulse move into the central nervous system, which we abbreviate as CNS, and then they move straight back to the effectors in sort of a curve. They move in form of a curve. As you can see here, you can see we have our stimulus here, and we're using this example of the Irish reflex. This is the eye, as you can see. Then an impulse is generated, which is carried by the sensory neurons to the central nervous system. Then in the central nervous system we have the relay neurons, these, which connects the impulse to the motor neurons. Then the motor neurons carry the impulses back to the muscles or effectors that contract and cause a response. So you can see that the movement is in the form of a curve or an arc. That's why we call it a reflex arc. Reflex actions, they aim at protecting the body against danger by producing quick responses. For example, when you look at the Irish reflex, protects the eye against damage by the bright light by causing a quick change in the size of the pupil so that too much light doesn't enter the eye to damage it. We also have another response to pain stimulus. For example, when you touch a hot object, you immediately withdraw your hand away from the hot object. Or if you touch a sharp object, like if you touch a sharp pin, you immediately withdraw your hand so that the body cells don't get damaged more. We come to reflex response to touch on a hot or a sharp object. What happens? One, in our skin, we have what we call temperature and pain receptors. If you touch on a hot object, the temperature receptors will detect that stimulus. If you touch on a sharp object like a pin, the pain receptors will detect that stimulus and then they generate an impulse and then send it to the central nervous system through the sensory neurons in the dorsal root. So these nerve impulses will enter the nerve system, will enter the central nervous system through the dorsal root. Then, as they enter the central nervous system, they go direct to the spinal cord, not to the brain, because these are reflex actions. The brain is not involved. So in the spinal cord, we have the relay neurons. These relay neurons, they connect the sensory neurons to motor neurons. So when these sensory neurons bring in the impulses, the relay neurons connect the impulses to the motor neurons. Then the motor neurons, they will emerge out of the spinal cord through the ventral root and then send impulses back to the muscles of the arm. Then the muscles of the arm contract and then pull the arm away from the harmful stimulus. And then the body will be protected against danger. So we have this diagram of the reflex arc, we have this is a finger, as you can see. You put it on a sharp object. This is a pin, as you can see. So the pain receptors in the skin, in the finger, they will detect the stimulus and then generate an impulse, and then this impulse is going to be carried through the sensory neurons. As you can see, it enters the central nervous system through this point we call the dorsal root, and then it goes where it is connected to the relay neurons. Then the relay neurons connect the impulse to the motor neurons. Then the motor neurons transmit the impulses to the muscles in the arm, and then the muscles will contract, and then you withdraw the finger away from that pin, and then you'll be protected. When you look in the spinal cord, we have this part here, which you call the gray matter. It appears gray because of the cells. When you look here, we say that part appears gray because it's made up of nerve cell bodies. And those nerve cell bodies, they give it the gray appearance. Then the other white part, it appears white because it's made up of axons of neurons which are myelinated with fat, with their fatty myelin sheaths that give a white appearance. And that's why we call it the white matter. So when you look at this reflex action, the impulses travel through the reflex arc in just a fraction of a second, which makes reflex actions very fast, because reflex actions are meant to safeguard the body against danger. So the responses have to be very fast. Then we have what we call a synapse. Synapse simply means where two or more neurons meet, or you can define it as a gap between two or more nerve cells. And when you look in the central nervous system, we have billions of nerve cells. And these nerve cells are linked, they are connected with many other neurons, but they are connected through synapses. When you look at the synapse, one neuron does not touch direct to another neuron. There is always a gap. And that gap is what we call a synaptic gap. It's always occupied with the fluid. And impulses always have to cross that synaptic gap by the help of chemicals called neurotransmitters. These neurotransmitters are always released from the membrane of neurons at the synapse. Let us look at how an impulse crosses a synapse. So we always have two neurons. Already we say that a synapse is a connection of two or more neurons. So let us take a case where we have two neurons joined. There is a gap in between. So when the neuron moves, or once the impulse arrives, down the axon of the first neuron, that first neuron is always called the presynaptic neuron. Pre means before, the neuron before the synapse. So once the impulse reaches that presynaptic neuron, the membrane of that presynaptic neuron will release chemicals called neurotransmitters. Then these neurotransmitters will diffuse across the synapse or the synaptic gap and attach to the membrane of the second neuron. That second neuron is what we call postsynaptic neuron. Post means after. That is a neuron after the synapse. Once they reach the postsynaptic neuron, they bind to receptor cells and they will trigger an impulse in the second neuron or postsynaptic neuron. And once the impulse has been triggered in the postsynaptic neuron, that means an impulse has crossed the synapse. Then once an impulse has been generated in the postsynaptic neuron or the second neuron, that postsynaptic neuron will release enzymes that break down the neurotransmitters. Then these neurotransmitters, the material, after being broken down, the materials are recycled. They are used to produce new neurotransmitters. So that's how an impulse crosses a synapse. So we have this diagram of a synapse. As you can see, these are impulses. This is one neuron. This is another neuron. So here we have a synapse here, and then this is another synapse. Even this is another synapse. But this is just an extension of one synapse. This is one neuron. You can call it the postsynaptic neuron. As you can see the arrow, the impulse is coming in. This is an axon of the presynaptic neuron. So as the impulse comes in and reaches this synapse or the synaptic membrane here of the presynaptic neuron, the presynaptic membrane will release chemicals called neurotransmitters. As you can see, they are released into this synaptic gap and they diffuse across the synaptic gap and they attach to the membrane of the postsynaptic neuron. And once they attach here, they stimulate an impulse, or they generate an impulse in this postsynaptic neuron, and then the impulse will continue moving, as you can see the arrow. And once the impulse has been generated in the postsynaptic neuron, this postsynaptic neuron will release chemicals or enzymes that will break down these neurotransmitters because they are no longer needed. And as after being broken down, the materials are used again to generate new neurotransmitters. So we have this extension of the diagram. As you can see, this is a cell body where we have the dendrites. So meaning that the impulses are coming in this direction, as you can see with the red arrows, impulses are coming in. So basically this is a synapse. Then this is the outgoing impulses. So we have this note. As we have already seen that impulses cross the synaptic gap by the help of chemicals, the neurotransmitters. And always on the postsynaptic membrane, we have what we call a receptor site, where a specific neurotransmitter will fit. So what happened that some chemicals can easily interfere with the working of the synapse by either imitating the synapse that is producing the same effect like the neurotransmitters. They can imitate the neurotransmitters, work like neurotransmitters, yet it's not the real neurotransmitters. Or others, they can block the neurotransmitters simply by competing the neurotransmitters for the receptor site. Chemical will occupy the receptor site first, and then the neurotransmitters, when they are released, they have nowhere to bind, and therefore it will have interfered with the action of the synapse or the action of the neurotransmitters. So the impulse will not be transmitted across the synaptic gap. So this is how most of the drugs work. The pain relief drugs, stimulant drugs, many of them, they work by imitating the neurotransmitters. So we have this assignment. which I would like you to try and answer during your free time, and then submit. Actually, you submit in the evening. Submit in the evening.